Let's look at the DEXA fat indices. First listed in your report will usually be the total body fat percentage. Total body fat represents a combination of the fat under our skin, the subcutaneous fat, and the fat around and inside the internal organs, the visceral fat. Fat tissue in general is not something bad or something we should be ashamed for. It's a natural storage solution which has evolutionarily developed so that we can store the excess energy and then mobilize it from there when we need it. And specifically, subcutaneous fat is the right place to put this excess energy in. However, the storage capacity of the subcutaneous tissue for this fat reserve is predetermined and limited in each given individual. And if our caloric balance is in such surplus that we exceed this storage capacity in the subcutaneous tissue, then further excess energy, further fat will overspill to fill up the space around organs like liver, pancreas, and heart, and also within organs and including inside organ cells, like inside the muscle cells. And this forms a metabolically active visceral fat tissue, which produces multiple molecules that negatively affect health via insulin resistance, systemic inflammation, and so on. And surprisingly, there can be people who have high total body fat, but at the same time, low visceral fat. So the majority of their fat is subcutaneous. And also it can be vice versa when the person looks quite skinny and their total body fat is in the 30th percentile, but their visceral adipose tissue is in the 90th percentile, which is extremely unhealthy and puts them at high risk. So it's not just the total body fat percentage we're interested in, but more importantly, for the context of health and longevity, it is the VAT estimate, the amount of visceral adipose tissue. Now, what do we consider a good VAT value on DEXA? Despite seemingly okay being average, that is at the 50th percentile in the modern Western society, will put us at a very high risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And that's why we should ideally be aiming VAT below the 25th percentile for our sex and age bracket. And also as a rough guide, we can consider that we aim VAT area of less than 100 centimeters squared, although it can be less than that. But more than 160 centimeters squared represents high risk as well. Another thing to remember about visceral fat is that it increases with age. So the older we are, the more grams of visceral fat we can have in order to fit the lower percentile. But as a rule of thumb, if we are over 1 kilogram of visceral adipose tissue at the age 40, we're probably hitting around 50th percentile. And if we are above 500 grams at the age 20, we'll be well above the 50th percentile. So what tools do we have that would enable us to leverage the amount of visceral adipose tissue in the correct direction? We're mainly speaking nutrition, particularly caloric restriction and dietary changes, such as cutting out refined carbs, added sugars, and alcohol. We're also speaking exercise in the form of combination of zone 2 and strength training. And of course, we're talking adequate quality sleep, as it is proven that poor sleep is linked to hormonal dysregulation that ultimately promotes visceral fat storage increases. And I would also like to add that visceral fat is quite resistant to intervention. When we intervene with caloric restriction and exercise, we see subcutaneous fat responding quite well, whereas visceral fat is somewhat very slow to respond. And that's why if you had an effective reduction of your visceral adipose tissue, I would suggest please don't go back to your previous habits, because putting on visceral adipose tissue is very easy and it usually bounces back quite quickly and probably to even worse extent than it was present before the intervention. And the older we get, the more difficult it would be to get it under control. There are also other fat indices like fat mass index and concerns at what body fat percentage I will see my six-pack, but we'll leave them to another DEXA video or maybe shorts where we can delve more into these less crucial metrics and instead move to check on the lean indices. And there are two of these lean indices: appendicular lean mass index and fat-free mass index. Appendicular lean mass index is the muscle mass in our extremities, so arms and legs, normalized for the height. So we take the extremity muscle mass in kilograms and divide it by height in meters squared, and that's how we get this index. This is the most direct proxy for skeletal muscle mass, and it corresponds to strength, metabolic health, and longevity and resistance against aging. Low appendicular lean mass index reflects sarcopenia, so insufficient muscularity, and it is linked with frailty, risk of falls, worse metabolic function, reduced lifespan, and so on. And in terms of goals for this index, I suggest aiming as high as you can possibly achieve, with genetics ultimately becoming your absolute limiting factor. A good goal will be to get above the 75th percentile for your age and sex, so the age-matched percentile, AM, whereas the sky's the limit and you can aim 97th percentile and above if your goal is the best odds at living long and healthy. The main tools to improve our appendicular lean mass are resistance training, adequate supply of amino acids, so intake of protein in the realms of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day, spread in 20 to 60 gram portion across the meals of the day, and adequate recovery, namely high quality sleep. The second lean index that I've mentioned is fat-free mass, which is essentially a total of all non-fat tissues in the body, including muscle, organs, bone, and water, normalized for height. This index, in my reading and in the reading of quite a few other longevity physicians, is a little bit secondary as compared to appendicular lean mass index because it also factors in non-muscle tissue. So whenever there is a discordance between fat-free mass and appendicular lean mass index, it's best to focus and target the percentiles for the latter. So essentially that's it. These are the main parameters to look for and interpret in your DEXA scan and to target with your interventions. In 3 words, we want to see lower percentiles for fat indices, higher percentiles for lean indices, and a Z-score above 0 for bone mineral density. And if that's not the case, we must take action. If you would like me to interpret your DEXA and give you a clear plan with all the progressions to improve the metrics we've just discussed and more, check the link for my consultations in the description section below, and I'll see you again soon in the next video.